Good afternoon, everybody. Good lunchtime. Welcome to another one of our sessions on modern slavery, and particularly today what we're going to be looking at is the assessment of risk. So it's a lunch and learn, so you know the way that we tend to do these. Put your feet up, grab your sandwich, grab your tea, and hopefully listen to something that gets you thinking and inspires you to take the next steps on. So today you've got three presenters that you'll see on your screen. There's myself, Helen. I work for Action Sustainability and the Supply Chain School. I specialise in sustainable procurement and modern slavery. Eleanor and Raj will introduce themselves in a moment when they do their sessions, but Eleanor is very kindly here today to give us a bit of an overview on risk, and then Raj will finish off giving us a little bit of a case study and an overview of what we're looking for. So you're going to hear from those guys very shortly. As we do with most of these things, it's a lunch and learn. So basically we've got, only 99. Go and grab somebody and get them to launch on. See if we can get 100. It's a large number, which fundamentally means that we'll be in transmit mode. So please sit back and listen. However, you are going to have opportunities for questions and answers. So what I will do throughout the session is facilitate the Q&A, bring them all in, and I will ask it at the end. So if you bear with us, we'll do the wrap up and Q&A at the end. We don't have any polls today, so you don't have to worry about juggling your Menti polls, but we will distribute the slides and you'll have an opportunity to do the feedback form at the end as well. So we will share slides and it is being recorded, so you'll get to see the recording as well. Get to see us all, warts and all. So just to give you, excuse me, a bit of context, this is the, if my maths is right, fourth in the fifth 5 elements that we're doing and have been doing since October last year, designed to take you on that journey from what the heck is modern slavery to how do we then address it within the utility sector. So in January, you would have, hopefully some of you will have heard from us around what due diligence looks like. And really today, it's about diving further into that due diligence activity and looking about how do I understand risk? How do I know how to evaluate it? We will be finishing off in March with the final one. That will be looking big world picture. So we will start to look a little bit more international around some of the things that are going on in our big, wide, scary world. But we'll also look at opportunities to give you a bit of feedback and get some feedback from you on how you found this programme of events, because obviously we've been delivering them since October. So I'll pass over to Eleanor in a moment, who can introduce herself, and she's going to give you an overview of what we mean by risk and how important it is to take that approach. I will give you a quick overview on how to actually do this, as much as I can in sort of 10-15 minutes, but a little bit of an insight into some of the practical things to think about. And then, as we try to do with all of these, is get one of our partner organisations within the utility sector. So Raj has very kindly offered to talk to you about the practicalities of how to do this rather than necessarily just the theory. And then we'll finish off around about 10-2 with a Q&A session. So I shall now stop sharing my screen and I shall pass over to Eleanor, who will very kindly start talking to us about the risk and what it is. So over to you, Eleanor.
Thanks, Helen. Let me just see if I can actually navigate my technology. Let me know if you can see that in presenting mode.
All good.
All good. Perfect. So thanks ever so much, Helen, for that. So let's look at evaluating the risk of modern slavery and labour exploitation within your supply chain. So what is a supply chain? It's a system of organisations, people, activities, information and resources involved in the supplying of a product or a services to a consumer or a customer. But why is it important to evaluate the risk of modern slavery? So we've got a few things to understand here. Firstly, you need to understand it. So we need to understand where you're sourcing from, what your risks are and where the impacts lie. So what's your impact? So there's certain things there like legal legislation, expectation, requirements on businesses to understanding where they're sourcing from and to understand also what their risk is. So gone are the days where it was acceptable to not understand and not really know where you're sourcing from. It's about operating ethically, so considering the security of your supply chain, considering your brand integrity and supply chain resilience. So we're now seeing a lot more interest now coming from requirements from investors. And it's about thinking about those collaborative actions. We're not going to tackle it alone. We need to be able to do it together. And it's also about recognizing the sphere of influence as well. So predominantly you will be sharing supply chains with a lot of people. So it's about understanding, where that sphere of influence can be. Where can you collaborate? What's the leverage that you've got? And remembering that evaluating your risk needs to be proportional. So you need to understand the leverage and the proportionality of it. How big is it? How much can you have an impact on it? And remember, keep it simple to drive engagement. That's really important. So how do I evaluate and manage modern slavery risk? I'll put my teeth back in, apologies. So first of all, it's about mapping your supply chain for transparency and risks, knowing where you're sourcing from and understanding what inherent and important risks are in the location that you're associated with where your product or service is coming from. Transparency and visibility is really, really important. And then gathering information about your suppliers, their own suppliers, and so on until you reach source. Consider a collaborative and strategic approach when looking at risk to map. Use your relationships with suppliers and bring your tier one on the journey with you. Understand what's happening in the supply chain and what's your leverage, and empowering your supply chain to enable you to be able to obtain that visibility. So knowing your business and risks will enable you to understand its impacts and your impacts, which can aid you to be able to identify where you need to provide remedy, where you need to fix things, where you need to make change. And this demonstrates maturity and commitment to responsible businesses practices. So something that we're seeing investors are asking for more and more. Horizon scanning right at the beginning is really important to look at what's ongoing and new trends that are in the areas where you're operating in and sourcing from. So what's going on where and what you're sourcing helps you identify to plan ahead proportionately and to be able to identify how much leverage you have in response to be able to do activities and to be able to do the right thing and make the change within those areas. And it's an opportunity for collaborative partnerships as well. So it helps you to start really setting out your stall. So knowing your suppliers and strategic partnerships then empowers your suppliers. Your desire to make lasting change should be inspirational, and you should be bringing them on the journey with you, recognising who else is sourcing from the same facilities on a different production line, considering reaching out for collaborative anti-slavery activities. Look at those supplier partnerships and work in a collaborative way and incentivise them to be able to work with you, and choose those and incentivize them over rather those transactional suppliers that you've got. Raise the awareness and acknowledge that this is a pre-competitive space. Think about how you engage and create those transparent cultures and creating trust. Create the awareness that there is a risk associated with the lack of transparency, and absolutely commercial sensitive information is to be kept confidential. That's why we call it a pre-competitive space. And once mapping's complete, ensure your due diligence strategy is victim-centric and victim-focused. So remember why you're doing it. Risk is not only about business risk, but it's about the risk to those within your operation supply chains too. And your strategy is defined about what you identify. Keep mapping simple. Create yourself a heat map. Get the right stakeholders in a room. Talk about what you do know, talk about what you don't know, and what actions you plan to do, and keep it fluent. It's ever changing. And then the next step's risk assessments. Supply chain risk management. Once you've mapped, use your victim-centric strategies to be able to manage everyday and exceptional risks along your supply chain and operations on a continual basis, with the objective of reducing vulnerability and ensuring continuity. So understanding what's your impact. Gathering information, engage your buying teams, engage your logistics, finance teams, glean any bit of information in terms of supply. Use what information you've already got, internal data sources, invoice, IT teams, billing and finance, buying teams. Use any relationship stream you have with your suppliers, and also those internet searches, specific suppliers if you want to deep dive. Gather that demographic data on vulnerable groups such as migrants, temporary or seasonal workforces to understand where they are and who they are, and overlay that with your horizon scanning piece. So what's the risk in the product or the service that you provide and where you're sourcing from? And using that horizon scanning piece to ascertain what the risk is in terms of the country and the industry, and assessing that level of risk. Is it high? Is it low? And the difference between mapping and risk assessing is you find the risk and then you're assessing what that risk is. And remember, mapping and risk assessment are not or due diligence. That's another piece as well. So it's important to look how all of it comes together to identify the where and the what, and then decide what steps you need to take. So due diligence, what requirements do you already have in place on your suppliers? How are your suppliers going to be compliant with your strategy objectives? How does the supply chain react to those requirements placed on it? Who are those suppliers who are compliant with requirements versus those who aren't? What's the difference? Why are they different? Are your requirements realistic? Are there any external factors stopping them from meeting your requirements? Do your requirements actually demonstrate your strategy and your commitment? And what policies and processes do you have in place on your suppliers to hold them to account to meet those requirements? How does that translate down their supply chain? What are they asking of their suppliers? How are they communicating this information? And how is it embedded and understood where it's fully intended to reach? So where is it meant to reach, and does it do what it's meant to do? In addition to your requirements, what activities do your suppliers do in response to human rights violations and modern slavery? Once you've mapped and risk assessed, you're able to understand from a risk perspective where you need to focus your due diligence activities according to what risk you've identified. Use your connections and relationships and your collaborative partnerships with other customers to exercise leverage. Ensure suppliers are aligned with your response to modern slavery and the issues faced. Be inspirational and bring them in on the journey, and incentivize those partnerships, and collaborate with specific industry initiatives such as Slave Free Alliance. Finally then, training and awareness, really such an important tool in the fight against slavery. Understand where your risk is and upskill accordingly. You absolutely cannot do this on your own within your business. Create that empowerment and let it be inspirational. Exec training, driving the commitment and having a strategy backed by the board senior leadership to demonstrate that commitment. On the ground, spot the signs and indicator training, those closest to it, provide them with the skills to identify it. Procurement training. Are your purchasing practices creating unintended consequences in the supply chain? How to switch buyers on to ask the right questions when sourcing and let them understand what impact is deriving from their decisions and actions. And supplier awareness, bring them on the journey too. Help them to understand your commitment, make it simple, engaging, inspiring, and partnership with you on the journey that you want to take. And that's me. Thank you very much. I am now going to hand back to Helen.
Unmute myself. Thank you. I'm going to just share my screen now. So bear with us on this interchangeables. So thank you, Eleanor. That's given a real sort of good oversight into the sort of principles around the sort of risk management and why it's important. I'm going to take a couple of things that Eleanor's talked about and sort of dive a bit deeper into those around how we actually practically do this, the sort of tools that you can have a look at. There is a couple of terminologies that you see a lot when you're trying to address this, and we see the terminology risk assessment and supply chain mapping interchangeably being used by organisations and a lot of the people that we deal with. They are two slightly different things, so it's important to understand the ask when you do get organisations to go away and help you in this space, or you ask your supply chain. You need to be really clear on what it is you're asking them to do. You also need to be really clear to understand why risk assessment is so important. So Eleanor's already alluded to the fact that it needs to be proportional, it needs to consider leverage. The reason is because your strategies on engaging this in terms of the sort of procurement requirements really do rely very heavily on that focused and targeted approach. You'll have seen from earlier sessions that we talked about that realistically, you probably have got a supply chain riddled with exploitation and modern slavery, and you cannot combat it all. UN guiding principles for business even talk about a proportional approach. Modern Slavery Act talks about a proportional approach. So really what you're looking to do is not tick boxes, but identify opportunities to address anything that you find. So risk influences the strategies that you adopt. As procurement teams, whether you are a supplier reacting to requirements or procurement people setting those requirements, understanding that risk heat map, whatever it looks like, really then starts to help you identify your next stages. So we'll look at this model a little bit later on, but fundamentally thinking about your green, amber and red risks is a good way to do it. Embed it into your activities that you're doing on a daily basis. Risk management in our industry is not a new concept. We do it all the time. And actually, risk management in supply chains is not a new concept. A lot of your procurement teams at the moment will be looking at risks for surety of supply, for resilience, for inflationary increases. You're understanding what's going on in your supply chain with different lenses. So start to think about how we apportion risk in terms of those human rights and modern slavery breaches. So a red, amber, green structure is perfectly fine. If you have something more sophisticated, then that is also also important. One of the benefits of your risk approach, however, is not necessarily arguing over whether something's a green, amber, or a red, but it's actually about bringing all those stakeholders together to open the discussion. And as Ellen has already said, actually understanding what you don't know so that you can go and find out what the true picture is. So look at your strategies and really start to think about what stages do we need to do to identify those risks. The beauty is that there's so much information out there when you're looking at your risk systems. You are not looking at this from a base level of nothing being known. The internet is huge. Nothing alone, you could spend a day going in and having a look at that and finding so many news stories, you'd probably worry about too much risk. But the idea is that there are stages to your risk assessment process that you need to do. One of the important things to help you establish your leverage and establish your influence is understand your spend and understand what you're buying. I see a lot with clients that I work with and organizations that I work with who don't know what they buy, don't know what categories of spend they've got, don't know how much money that they've got with certain suppliers. Let's park modern slavery to one side and talk basic procurement here. That's not necessarily a good thing in a general term, but to actually get to grips with what your risks look like and understand that leverage, it is very important to understand those. You then need to have that conversation, and we'll go into that in a moment, around what is the risk, what is it that exists. And from the first time you do this, it's about understanding what risk exists before you even look at leverage, before you even look at spend. And from that perspective, looking at that whole life, where is it? Is it a direct risk for me? i.e. it's on my doorstep, in my office, in a site that I'm working on? Or is it an indirect risk like solar panels, where we know that there's exploitation happening, but it's so far down the supply chain, I need to think about how to address that. They are important distinguishers when you're looking at your risk, because they will influence your strategies going forward. Once you've looked at that, that starts to give you a picture then of how do I dig deeper? Where do I need to dig deeper? And again, remember, we've talked about this before, the tortoise and the hare. It's about identifying slowly and surely which are my priorities, picking those, moving on to the next one. You will not address all of these in a very short space of time. So as we say, the first thing we need to get better on as an industry in general is data. Data is key. When you undertake your risk assessment, understand what's your spend. And when you're looking at spend, and I've done this recently with a client, there can be loads of spend and then said, oh yeah, by the way, 5 of those we're not actually doing contracts with in the next 12 months, we're getting rid of them. So actually understanding the spend in terms of historical spend around categories, but also thinking about what that future spend looks like is just as important. I know that I may have decided that I have got a catering contract. At the moment, I outsource to a local chip shop. I know that in the next 12 months, I'm going to be putting a fully fledged catering contract in place that I need to be thinking about. So the future is just as important as the past, so that you start to understand your leverage going forward. As we said, talk about whether things are direct or indirect. Materials, is it a material spend? Is it a subcontractor spend? Please don't be frightened to look at subcontractors. In fact, I very strongly advise you to look at them and probably put them ahead of materials in terms of response, because subcontractors, we have this thing in our industry that it's a black art. It's everybody else's risk, not mine. And that risk dumping approach we take to subcontracting means that there is probably a greater risk of exploitation happening in the supply chain, because we just rely on contracts to manage that going forward. So again, what I see a lot with the clients that we work with is, Helen, here's my material spend, here's my labour agency spend, forgetting all this raft of other spend that you need to consider. In addition to that, indirect should also be included. And by indirect, I mean supporting stuff like your IT, like your rates, like your bills, like the risk needs to be considered in terms of what's your biggest expenditure. The next stage is then to look at category definition. So again, what I tend to see a lot of organizations do is jump straight into supply chain, suppliers, but actually a good way to step back is to look at the category first. So what is the category that I'm buying? And think about the level of definition. So when we're starting to talk about category spend, it's not just I'm buying M&E, because actually if I look at mechanical and electrical as a spend, I can go into sub elements of spend definition in there and find that the supply chain for a light from Philips is a completely different supply chain to a lift manufacturer who puts that in, and they're both categorized as mechanical and electrical. So think about the level of detail you have around your categories to ensure excuse me, to ensure that it is at the right level of detail associated with. That doesn't mean that if you're looking at your pens you need to worry about a red pen and a blue pen. That's a little too detailed, but making sure that fundamentally the purpose of this is to create procurement strategies, supply chain engagement programs that are meaningful and proportional. So the data up front really helps you influence in that space. So be specific, be really difficult, be clear on the difference between products and services when you're putting that category together. Again, I've had experience working with clients where they've said, oh yeah, we've got catering or we've got piling. Some of it's piling equipment and piling materials. Some of it's a piling services contract. They are two very different types of risks. So again, thinking about not only the category, but whether it's a subcontract or whether it's a materials is really important. Then, I don't know about you, but if I look at your spend and if I look at maybe some of the big clients and then the tier ones, when I talk to them, they go very white and pale and say, do you know how many suppliers we deal with, Helen? Or how many categories of spend? I've seen sheets that I've worked with that are hundreds and hundreds of lines long. The reality is, though, that in true traditional procurement activity, you'll have an 80-20 rule. 80% of your spend will be with 20% of your supply base. So don't be frightened to look at some of the tail spend and go, just too small, too influential. Don't need to look at that. Focus on some of those big strategic relationships first when you're thinking about the risk and the categories that are important to you. One slight caveat with that, however, is that you may do cast your eye over the tail spend, because there may be some high risk stuff that you need to go and just have a quick look at. You might not have a lot of spend, but there might be things going on to go and have a look at, because I can guarantee if something comes and, pardon the expression, bites you in the bum, usually it is that tail end spend that you potentially haven't been looking at a huge amount. So do cast your eye at that tail spend, but don't worry about it too much. There are probably quick things that you can do within that area. The key then is to bring together that risk assessment. So you've got the data, you've got the category. What you now need to do is assess that risk. So it is literally as simple, I say slightly laughingly, of looking at, if I am purchasing construction, if I am purchasing pumps, if I am purchasing demolition services, what do I need to think about in terms of, have I got geographical risk in my supply chain? Now, the success of this activity is going to be dependent on the people in the room. You may end up with a map that's very red because nobody knows anything. And that's probably because either A, you haven't invited the right people, or alternatively, they just haven't really thought about it before and your procurement structure isn't really geared towards more of a category approach. So, excuse me, thinking about who to invite to these things is really, really important. So Ellen, as Ellen has alluded to, procurement tend to be the ones that get lumped with it. It's procurement, it's supply chain, it's all their job. But actually bringing people in from like HR, sales, even potentially bring your supply chain in, or at least think about engaging with some of your supply chain in this space so that they can actually help influence what's really going on in those supply chains. The reality is that the majority of your key spend, you will know roughly what a supply chain looks like because you're buying it every day. You may not be thinking about human rights or modern slavery, but you'll be thinking about other issues in that supply chain. So you'll know more than you think you do. Look at geographical risk, look at industry risk. We know already in this industry how many industries are high risk. I can talk to 5 or 6 different people in the school or as clients. They'll give me the same categories, they'll give me the same risks. So you can use that as a start. We know that we look at things where there is low skilled labour, low paid, high reliance on transient workforce, high reliance on migrant workforce, potentially is a risk for you to think about. So break it down into those key elements. Once you've identified the risk, you'll see a nice big map, probably with lots of red. And there'll be a scary thing of like, oh my God. So then over that, you need to then start thinking about addressing some of the activities. So the risk assessment process itself isn't just about identifying where the risk sits, but also what are you already doing? You may already have some policies, codes of conduct, you may already be undertaking some audits, you may already have certain things in place that might take a red risk and turn it into an amber risk. Now, my only word of warning on this one is that if you have lots of policies, don't turn a red risk into a green risk. You turn it into an amber risk, because the reality is that a green risk only transpires when we know that you're auditing, you're verifying, and the evidence of the policy being applied can be provided, because everyone can sign a charter, everyone can sign a code of conduct, everyone can actually commit to a policy and then not do anything. So the green bit is then about the activity to say, they've said they do this and we know they're doing this. So you start to see that transition between the red, amber and green. And then obviously we need to think about leverage. And I've seen somebody already talking about, you have no leverage over Uyghur camps in China creating polysilicon on solar panels. It's abhorrent and it's wrong, but you have no leverage. So understanding your strategies on how to address this is what's really important. Putting it as a risk and a concern, you need to have it there because you know it's there. But actually your procurement strategies that you adopt later on won't be, I'm going to do an ITT and a PQQ question. It's going to be, I'm going to work with certain organizations who are working in this space. I'm going to go and collaborate in this space. So using different strategies to address these issues is really important. It is not all about setting a load of people on a plane and sending them off to audit in China. That is not necessarily going to get you what you need to do. Use the resources, excuse me, I have a COVID cough. Use the resources available online. It's not hard. Seriously, if I've been able to do this over the last 4 or 5 years, anyone can. You go and have a look, take an interest in the categories that you're doing. There are maps, there are already categories that have been identified as high risk that you can go and get more information from. There are things in places like the Global Slavery Index, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. You can go and start getting a lot of detail and information online around companies and categories and initiatives. You know, people like the Slave Free Alliance, people like the Global Slavery Index, Modern Slavery Helpline, Unseen, they're all providing a huge amount of data and information that you can use to start understanding some of the challenges and risks associated with the procurement that you're looking at. So intelligence isn't a problem. What you've got to do is use the intelligence intelligently. And understand what to do with that information when you find it. As I said, in our industry and stuff we've done through the supply chain school, we already know regularly what the sort of trades are that you should be looking at. If nothing else, and you go, Helen, I don't know what my spend is, I don't know what my categories are, just give me something to start looking at. Well, we can look at things like cleaning products, security, labour agencies, catering services and food that's associated with that, PPE, waste management. We're all aware of the Biffa incident at the moment. We've got cases and evidence now in most of these sectors where we know these issues are being addressed. We also know in products like solar panels, like bricks, like timber, you may be looking at FSC or BS 6001. So actually understanding some of those areas of what industries are already doing around these standards is really, really important. So even if you went, I'm further down the supply chain, I don't have that much information, you can at least start picking some of these trades that the industries recognise are high trade, high risk, and working with your clients to address some of these issues. The key here is that what you're looking to do is prioritize. So what you're looking for eventually is a heat map that not only gives you those red, amber and greens, but starts to help you prioritize which of those key bits. So where you have a high risk, where you have a high amount of influence, like security, like waste management, you may decide those are your key priority areas, and that's what you're going to focus on in terms of putting your procurement strategies together. That's the end game for most of this when you're putting this risk is, I have this information, what do I do with it? And that's where I need to start getting into the supply chain. Don't forget things like rates, rent, you know, design organizations. I don't mean designer Gucci, I mean design organization, whatever your spend looks like. Utility bills, they're in there. You know, what you spend on a regular basis, think about it. There may be high risks, but your leverage will be low in some of these areas. So don't be scared to put that to one side and say, I have no leverage, I have nothing. I'll come back and relook at that. And that's the important thing with the risk assessment, is it's a continuous process. Keep refining it, keep updating it. As you get more intelligence and more understanding of what's going on, it will get finessed, it will get refined, it will get improved. Then, as we've already talked about, the key is then using this. So once you've identified the risk, using your due diligence. So you'll see a lot of people in the recommendations talking about what's your risk and due diligence. They're sort of connected, but they're not the same thing. The risk assessment process helps you identify what due diligence activity you need to have in place for the supply chain. It is about that prioritized approach. The reality is that once you know what you've got to do and know what your trades are, you should be then going into the supply chain, as we talked in the last session, looking at what's the policy, where are my risks, where's my focus and my prioritization. You'd want to see the same thing with your supply chain that you're doing. You want to see the same thing that they're doing, maybe not as sophisticated, maybe not as many categories, but you still want to see that I've had to think about the way the risk works and what that is to my business. Then obviously start to think about how you address that in those action plans. And this again is to Eleanor's point earlier on about that sort of collaborative approach. It may not be you doing something, it may be you working with your client or working with some of your peer organizations. And then obviously ensure that you're continually improving. And as we've already said, victim-centric through everything that we're doing, is that fundamentally it's about the help to the victim that we need to make sure is available. Once you've actually identified that, because you're going, oh my God, Helen, is that not it? You might want to start thinking about the mapping, but you won't necessarily do the mapping straight away. And by mapping, what we're literally talking about here is, if I know that I've got a subcontract for, I don't know, bricks, for building a brick wall, let's take it really simply. In that subcontract, I'm going to have the labor, I'm going to have the bricks, I'm going to have to go in and see where the bricks come from, which country they come from, which department they come. That's a huge amount of work. We've done this in the supply chain school. We've done it around things like high-vis vests. We've done cleaning products, and a high-vis vest itself, from two different partners and two different organizations, has two completely different maps. So mapping and really getting into the supply chain and understanding what's happening within those tiers is good, but it's a long-term investment and needs to be done really targetedly in a way that can really start to drive. And we'll cover some of this in the international bit next time in March, about how we might want to pick some of those category areas. And it might be something that the school would help with, or you know, the utility sector together could come up with some approach to doing that. It's definitely more of a collaborative world than you guys going in and doing it. But what you need to be aware of is your role. So your role in that process, it might not be at the front end, it might be at the tail end, or it might be in the middle, and I'll go into that in a moment. So the reality is that from a risk assessment process, what you're trying to do is come up with your strategies. Some of it will be ITT, PQQ, selection criteria, contract conditions. Some of it might be more in that softer side of stuff, procurement, that I love, that not a lot of people do, which is that collaborative innovation, development, you know, working with the supply chain collectively. And where you have the red risk, that's where you really need to be getting under the bonnet of what's going on in the supply chain, understanding what the supplier can do. That's time consuming, but obviously it's focusing on the effort where it needs to be the most, and addressing those issues. And don't be frightened to think about some of those green risks. They're just not risks, they're low priority. So don't be frightened just putting in contract terms or standard T's and C's, or a little bit about, you know, this is the way we do it. You will have thousands of suppliers, you cannot do this for everything. So that prioritized approach really helps in that area. And then, just as I can feel some of you choking on your sandwiches going, Helen, we're really low down the supply chain. That's all really good, but what do I do? Actually, to a certain extent, you sort of do the same, but it's a proportional response. It's the way you react. And it's also being aware very much of the conversation that's coming down the supply chain. So a client should be setting those expectations. And we're going to hear from Raj in a minute around what's happening in Cadent around setting those priorities, setting that level expectation, not exploitation. Then going into tier one to say, actually, what we want to do is start to see evidence of this due diligence. And we want tier one to talk to tier two. The reality is at tier two, you may be a really small SME. So you are part of the education in terms of providing the information upstream to where things are coming from. So be prepared to talk about, you know, what data you've got, where you buy things from, start to connect those dots. Be very aware that I know there'll be a nervousness around competitive advantage, and you're just coming to me because fundamentally you're going to bypass me and go to someone and get it cheaper. That is not the purpose of this at all. The purpose of this is the transparent supply chain. So understanding, I know what my risk is, I know why they're asking me this, and I know how to help address these issues is really important. So understand that, provide data, ask for guidance and help. You're not expected to know everything. If I let you into a little secret, a lot of the clients don't know everything either. So actually the reality is it's about how we bring all this together. If you're a small organization, use temporary labor, waste management, start to think about the odd little question that you can add in, start to think about how you can actually upskill your own organization. And remember, you're part of a transparent supply chain. So the risk and questions that are coming to you is because there's a genuine concern this needs to be addressed. So part of this is about you creating that transparent supply chain. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Hopefully that's given you a good insight. I've talked to you about the theory. Now I'm going to hand you over to the lovely Raj, who's going to talk to you about some of the practical challenges on how we do this. So over to yourself, Raj.
Thank you, Rosie. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, just going to share my screen now. Let me know if you're getting a full screen, which you should do presently. Is that it?
Can't at the moment, Raj. Do you want me to share my screen?
Technical problems. Yes, go on then. Yeah.
Just tell me next when you need me to. Bear with me.
Okie doke. Right. Sorry, just a minute. I seem to have lost you completely. Just bear with me.
Wonderful technical skills. Bear with us, guys. We will be recording this, by the way, so you will be able to see the recording. I never know whether they edit out the bits where we have to sit and talk and tell a joke. Are you there, Raj?
I'm back now, and hopefully you can hear me, right? Okay.
Yep, can.
So, going on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to cover quite a few topics here. I've numbered them quickly for your reference. We're going to talk, the first three are more about how we do modern slavery and the tackling of it at Cadent itself. And then we slip into the last three slides, which are more around what we do in the supply chain for it. And the reason for putting them in that order is because you need to be able to walk the talk, as it were, before you can ask others or expect others to do something in this space. So you can go to the next slide, Helen. So this is all about Cadent, but it is very much in the context of modern slavery. You might see some of the numbers in the middle of the screen and think, oh, this is just Cadent trying to tell everybody how big they are. But that is not the case. Every single line item there has got a very relevant meaning in terms of what we're discussing today. Starting from the top left-hand corner, that happens to be the objective for Cadent, keeping people warm while protecting the planet. And in terms of protecting the planet, along with that comes protecting the people on the planet. So very much up there. And then the blue tile on the bottom left-hand corner is one of our 4 values. And clearly we've picked the one that makes most sense in the context of modern slavery. So one of our key values as a company is that we take responsibility, and sitting within that value is a very clear line about speaking up when things aren't right. And everything that Ellen has covered before and Helen has talked about, it is about doing the right thing and speaking up when things aren't right in this context, in the context of modern slavery. So, as I said, in terms of walking our talk, what we have done is created a very detailed modern slavery statement. It's quite current. It says 2020, 2021, and that was released sort of summer, autumn last year. Just to give you an insight into why this is all relevant for Cadent, we are the country's largest gas distribution network, and therefore 131,000 kilometers of pipe that falls into most of England comes within our remit. We also happen to be the national gas emergency service for the whole of the country, for the whole of Britain. So if anybody rings 0800 and says, I can smell gas, it comes to Cadent first, and then we pass that on. So that puts us in quite a unique situation where all kinds of vulnerable areas of society, people living on their own, elderly people, people with learning difficulties, can all be part of that customer base that Cadent has. And that gives us an opportunity to actually look out. If we train our operators correctly, it actually gives us an opportunity to look out for modern slavery as part of our day-to-day business. In terms of modern slavery in our supply chain, we have over 1,000 suppliers. We have actually got 2,000 and something suppliers, but in terms of the ones with the largest amount of business, and Helen talked about prioritization and the Pareto and all that. So yeah, over 1,000 suppliers with whom we spend over £1 billion worth of money. We also have a workforce that is over 6,000 strong. So these are huge numbers, and the bigger these numbers get, the more the chances of coming across modern slavery. And that is why I put those numbers in there. Finally, I'd like to talk about the operating model. So till recently, till we were in this price control period, which started in April last year, we were in what we call Rio 1. And in Rio 1, the model that we took with subcontracting, and Helen mentioned subcontracting again, was that we went through 1 or 2 very large tier 1 companies and then expected them to look after our tier 2s and 3s. That has changed. From April 2021 onwards, we are in Rio 2, and what we have done here now is we have a more direct connection with local delivery partners, and we have a more direct connection with the management organization that looks after those local delivery partners for us. We have 5 regions within Cadent, so we have 5 CMOs, and we have over 60 local delivery partners. And these are, as you go down those tiers, you come across some very large, big blue chip companies, and then you go all the way down to small little Janet and John businesses, you know, a 2-man, 3-man, 5-man band. I shouldn't say man anymore, but yes. So it's a whole plethora of different kinds of suppliers that we come across, and it becomes all the more important then that, given our position that you can see on this page, we have a very solid approach to modern slavery. So next slide, please, Helen. So we have Steve Fraser there, our Chief Executive Officer, and he has clearly made a very large impact on how Cadent manages modern slavery. The statement that I mentioned in the previous slide is available for anyone to click on and have a look at. It's in the public space, and I would encourage people who are trying to build their own modern slavery approaches to take a look at it. You know, steal with pride. If there are certain good ideas in there that you would like to adopt for your own companies, so be it. So we have this statement, and then supporting that, we have a number of activities within Cadent that play into this arena. So first of all, let's start with recruiting, developing, and rewarding our own people. As I said, we have a huge workforce, 6,000 plus. What we have done in that space is we are using external parties to actually benchmark the process by which people enter our organization. Yeah. We're also looking at the living wage, and we're talking about the real living wage here. So we're paying above what we need to pay. So £10.90 per hour is where we are at the moment. We monitor compliance to our recruitment policies and processes in a very significant way. Yeah. And then finally, we have a whole range of internal communities. So Women at Cadent, Embrace, which is all about race equality, the Cadent military community, Pride at Work, and Thrive, which is more about disabilities. In all those areas, while we're looking at our own people, we get an opportunity to think about it in terms of exploitation, or in terms of, you know, making sure that we're looking after our people properly. And then finally, the last box at the bottom there is about the modern slavery statement registry itself, which is run by the government. they've actually set quite a high benchmark in terms of people needing to do it, 35 million plus. But we encourage all our suppliers to look at what Cadent has done in that space and follow suit. Next slide, please, Helen. So we do have a number of sort of three main areas of activity in this space. One is about speaking up. So we have created a very well-defined code of conduct, which our suppliers are expected to follow. We get them to sign up to it at pre-qualification stage, but then we also monitor how closely they are doing what they said they would do once they become our suppliers. In terms of training and awareness, we have joined up with the Supply Chain Sustainability School that Helen works at. And because we are partners at the school, we encourage all our suppliers to become members of the school. More than 83% by spend value of Cadent's suppliers are actually members of the school. And we monitor that number. We make promises to Ofgem, the regulator, and we keep on top of it. So that's another thing in terms of training. And then finally, our own internal policies and procedures. Each one that you see there is actually a written policy. It goes through a policy approval committee, and then it's accurately monitored, and there is assurance built around it to make sure that we're following our own policies. Next slide, Helen. Okay. So we move on then to engaging with our supply chain. So I've taken a 1, 2, 3 approach just to keep things really simple in our heads. So at number 1, we've got pre-qualification and tendering. This is before a supplier actually becomes part of Cadent's supply chain. So we put them through filters such as UVDB and Achilles and various other industry memberships. Within our own pre-qualification questionnaire and the request for proposal that our buyers at Cadent use when engaging with the suppliers, we have built in very clear questions, evaluation sets, answers that they can use as guidance when conducting their PQQ and RFP processes. And those questions are very clearly intended to bring out modern slavery examples, if there are any, from the supplier side, and then allows us to do something about it. The statement required at pre-qualification stage also, if we come across a high-risk supplier, we would actually take action then and there and stop them from continuing with the process. So number 2 is supplier contracts. Once the tendering process is complete and we are in contract with the supplier, we do have clauses in the contract that allow us to audit what has gone on when the contractor is performing what they're doing for Cadent. And also the sustainable procurement standard, which I actually wrote myself, works very well in that context in terms of contract management. And then finally, we're also looking at active assurance. So we have internal and external audit processes that allow, and I'll talk about that in a bit more on the next slide, that allow us to monitor what's going on. So next slide, please, Helen. So I'm sorry about the rather busy nature of the slide, but there's a lot going on there. So on the top left-hand corner, I'd like to talk about how we conduct risk and assurance. So this is done at 3 different levels. We have a Cadent QA team that reports into me, and they sit within procurement, and that has been done on purpose. They would go out and audit our suppliers and subcontractors. And when they do that, there is a well-defined question set that caters for modern slavery. So that is one aspect of it. The other one is using third-party audits like Dow Jones, Dun & Bradstreet. We'll also keep our ears to the ground in terms of adverse publicity that might be generated around modern slavery from the supply chain, from Cadent supply chain. So we have triggers, electronic triggers, which are web-based that drive those kind of results there. And then finally, within our SAP Ariba system, which is our ERP system, we have a supplier risk module that again caters for monitoring and questioning around modern slavery. We are members of the Slave Free Alliance, and we are members of the school, as I said. So on the bottom left-hand corner, we have a number of external bodies that help us with our journey into controlling and managing modern slavery. On the top right-hand side, I'd like to talk about the audits once again. A supplier monitoring program, which includes the financial and socio-economic adverse press that I mentioned. There are third parties that will do this for you, and I appreciate with some of the smaller businesses, sort of funding and paying for those kind of services might be difficult, but it doesn't stop you from working with Cadent. And we'd like to extend a hand out to our supply chain who would like to understand a bit more about this and maybe piggyback on some of the resources that we've got. And then finally, I'd also like to talk about Resolver. So Resolver is an internal risk management system which records all the risks that are potentially likely to affect Cadent, and more specifically its supply chain as well. So we do have a very good entry in our Resolver system that constantly keeps our buyers, our senior managers, and our board of directors switched on about the risks coming from modern slavery. So that's something else we do. The next slide. I mean, finally, from the colors, you might guess that this is very much Achilles. So as next steps, what we would like to do is, on the one hand, we would like to look at any on-site labor practice audits or inspections. And this is where we would employ somebody like Achilles, or I'm sure there are other organizations who can do this for you as well, where they will go out and visit a site, look at the rates of pay, look at the recruitment process that led to somebody working on that site, actually check the right to work documents, question laborers, workers about the hours of work, and in confidence, allow them to disclose any working standard malpractices or discrimination that's happening there. But that is not all. We can also do it at company level. So we can get third parties to go out and audit on behalf of Cadent in a much more detailed manner than we could probably do ourselves. We can pay for going out and doing these labor practice audits at company level. So those are the two sort of next steps, if you like, as far as Cadent is concerned. That's where we would like to get to. I think that's kind of it. If there are any questions, I'd like to take them now.
That's brilliant, Raj. We've got a few questions, so I think what we'll do is we'll start wrapping up and then do some questions at the end, if that's okay. So very quickly, just as we always do, links will come with the slides. There's a huge range of resources. One of the questions that I've got is around questions that we can put in the procurement process around labour agencies and things. We've linked a couple of times to the procurement guide. It literally is a copy and paste and a starter for 10. But there are a multitude of things out there. So do recommend using those resources where you can. Just before we then get into the questions and answers, again, because I see a couple of them are around international, so we've got you thinking, which is good. We have one more session on the 16th of March, and then we will have done a nice little journey for you, looking specifically at the international supply chains. So we will delve a little bit more into maybe some of those collaborative arrangements, things that you can think about from an international perspective that feels a little bit less in your control and leverage. So we'll do that on the 16th. So just before we wrap up, we've got about 5 minutes, which is great, to do some questions and answers. Excuse me. One I have, Eleanor, I know you'd the question here about global suppliers who are not bound by the Modern Slavery Act.
Yeah, I started to respond to the question and put great question, and then I didn't answer my technology. So somebody's probably got a response that says great question, but not actually a response to the question. Yeah, so great question. This is where it's really important. We're seeing, yes, the UK's got the Modern Slavery Act, but we're also seeing a lot of other countries and collaborations of countries as well, starting to think about passing legislation. So there is, Australia, we've got France, California, the USA with their Tariff Act, and agreed legislation. We've now got Norway, the Netherlands and Germany on their supply chain due diligence, and we've got other countries proposing legislation. It is gaining traction. It is moving very fast. That said, this is also about what can you do rather than waiting for that legislation for those countries who aren't in scope of the UK Modern Slavery Act or potentially any other legislation. This is about that leverage piece. This is about understanding where you've got that legislation, where you've got that leverage and where you've got that proportionality. And it's about that, bringing them on the journey and understanding this is the right thing to do, and you doing this together collaboratively. Do you want to be working with supply chains that just because it's not legislation don't need to respect, what's going on in terms of that worker welfare down the supply chain? Is my response to that.
Brilliant, thanks, Eleanor. And we've got one linked to that actually, which I'll answer, which is what happens if you as a UK supplier are not bound by the Modern Slavery Act, i.e. you're not within the threshold. The reality is you are. The Act applies to every single business, regardless of the size. So it's important to make sure you understand the thing that you're not bound by is the reporting requirements under the Modern Slavery Act. A good analogy of this, or to think about it, is around this victim-centric approach. If you are found guilty of either exploiting somebody, then you've got big issues anyway. But if you are actually negligent in your due diligence around recruitment, bringing people on board, not really putting good systems in place, we're seeing this with BIFA, then the civil litigation is what is going to happen. So any victim has the right to sue for compensation. So my strong advice on this one, and I think Raj actually alluded to it earlier on as well, is regardless of the size of your business, you need an approach to address this issue to protect yourself and the victims. And then I would just echo Raj's point, actually then do a statement, because you're doing stuff anyway. Yeah. Raj,
it doesn't cost you anything, and as long as you have a statement and you are happy to put it out there in the public space, the best public space you could think of is that modern slavery register for the government, because anybody can reach out to it. People know it's there, and even though, like I said, even though the threshold is 35 million, it doesn't matter. You can be a £2 million company and still put it on. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, definitely. So my advice is go back, look at the due diligence, get yourself, and then do a statement if you want to. Go and have a look at what's on the registry. Everyone can access it. The supplier, okay, there's a couple of really interesting ones in here. A couple linked. The next lunch and learn sessions on international trade. Can we look into this to help our risk mapping? Peter, I don't know, we haven't done the agenda yet, so I'm assuming we will do, but the whole idea is to use the intelligence as much as possible. So that plus the links I showed you around the intelligence of what's going on in the international waters will help with that risk mapping, will help with that information, and we'll make sure links are set out. But yes, we will make sure that we can talk about how that information can help influence that international conversation. There's an interesting one here, and Eleanor, I'm going to take your thought on this. Certain companies in certain countries are difficult to audit and communicate with. Is it okay to blacklist working with such companies from our supply chain? What's your thought?
Again, a really great question, but I'll try and answer this stuff. This is where we appreciate, you know, audits is a tick box exercise. What are you actually getting back from your auditing from that? And in terms of if they're that difficult and the relationship is that strained, then, you know, have you given them the opportunity to understand why you're doing what you're doing? How have you communicated your commitment and your policies and strategy around what your commitment is? My challenge is if you haven't given them that opportunity, then I think it'd be particularly unfair to blacklist them when they need to be able to have the opportunity to want to be able to come along that journey with commitment with you. That said, if you know you understand that you've put all these stipulation requirements in place and they have been received and understood and they've still not been followed, then you know you need to start then thinking about, I'm not going to turn around and say yes, you need to stop working with those suppliers. However, what I do say is, what's the level of risk in that supply chain? So you need to determine, is that risk acceptable to your business or not, and then you take your decisions from that.
Definitely leverage is key. Raj, you have a comment?
Yeah, all I was going to say is, in that context, blacklisting is almost like brushing it under the carpet, because you're pushing them away and saying, we don't want to talk to you anymore. But that could have a detrimental effect. It's better to actually do something about it. And if you haven't got the means to do it yourself, then escalate it upwards, you know, in whichever direction you can. Look at your peers, form an association and go and deal with it, rather than saying, you know, blacklist. Yeah,
definitely. And remember, my sort of contribution is every approach you have is victim centric. So if you blacklist, you're not helping victims, you're just saying, I don't want to deal with it. So the victim centric piece has to be center of what you're looking at. This is what the legislation supposedly is trying to do, is help the victims. So blacklisting doesn't really help. Internationally, I can see lots of questions, and we've run out of time, unfortunately, around, you know, what about China and Pakistan? let's deal with those at the next international aspect. One key thing I am seeing, but I'll take back to the utility guys, is about guidance on audits and what to do on site checks. There are lots of organizations, Slave Free, Achilles, we do at AS, we'll do lots of things, but I think what it might be worth us doing in the school is to think about how we can put some checklists together for you collaboratively so that you can use them as a base checklist, if that makes sense, and then you can go and decide whether you want to spend money on somebody who really understands it, but at least it gives you a start point. So leave that one with us. We might have to go and have a bit of an additional discussion. We haven't got a quick answer for you on that one. So we're 1 minute over. Apologies for the slight delay. So what I'd like to do is say a massive thank you to Raj and Eleanor. It's been a really interesting session. Interestingly, lots of questions around the international ones. So for those of you who are interested, come to that one, because hopefully we can answer more of them. You will shut down. When you shut down, you'll get a feedback form. As we always ask, please complete the feedback form. As a group, we will be looking at all of those over all of the 5 to see how well this is done. So from my perspective, a massive thank you to all of you who've stayed with us. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. Hope you've enjoyed the session, and maybe we'll see you on the 16th of March. Thanks, everybody.